Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Deirdre, for coordinating the details for me to be here. And thank you, Morton. Greetings, everyone. This is really like a time machine for me. In many respects, my book, The Intentional Legacy, is a reflection on what I've learned from the conservative movement. And as I open up my comments this morning, there's three keys to creating a successful legacy that I'd like to share with you this morning. And I'll get to those in a few minutes. But I can't help but reflect that we've already had on display what goes into the creation of a very powerful legacy, and that is the influence that you can have on someone else's life. That may be in the context.
Thank you.
How's that? You hear a little bit better? But you see in real time that is the case here at Leadership Institute and with Morton Blackwell. The influence that Morton has had through investing in other people's lives, I think we will all wonder at the extent of that. 195,000 people taking a set of ideas and, again, taking it to a very meaningful place, that of action. I think the nature of training, what happens here at the Leadership Institute, inherently emphasizes the importance of legacy. This place was born out of a desire to see the next generation of conservative leaders step into the public square and help guide a conversation about the direction of our country, about the soul of our country, and about the destiny of our country. The problems that were born out of the early 20th century came home to roost, and out of that, the modern conservative movement was born. And now, in some respects, it's your turn. The problems of the 80s and 90s up to the present are coming home to roost, and the ball is very much in your court to solve them. If I might suggest a reason or two why the deepest levels of commitment and sort of a cause orientation emanate out of this place, we can go back to the 60s and early 70s just briefly. You had the guns and butter policies of the Johnson administration eroding the post-war confidence in our leadership. You had the Bretton Woods promises, which were being broken in that time frame. The French were the first to grow very suspicious. They had seen the massive devaluations firsthand in the UK in the 1930s. And there was a young man who had the ear of Charles de Gaulle, who had been there in the UK as financial attaché, Jacques Rueff. He was in London as a young man, and so in an older place in life, a more mature place in life, he was trying to share the wisdom that he had gained with Rueff, and was pretty boisterous in his opinions that the French interests would not be well supervised if left in the hands of the United States. That was the mid-'60s. Gold began to flow from the United States to France, and Nixon, as you know, broke the gold window and broke the Bretton Woods structure there in 1971, and monetary madness ensued. So you had the Nixon, the Ford, and the Carter administrations operating in a time of confusion, in a time of chaos, in a time of very mixed signals. On the one hand, you have annual GDP, which was averaging 9.6% per year for nearly 13 years. At the same time, you have gross monetary instability and fading international confidence in the U.S. dollar. And there was a subtle, if not ultimately menacing, bear market in equities, which stretched from 1968 to 1981, with a very nasty recession sandwiched in from 1973 to 1975. So Morton Blackwell cut his teeth in an age of change, in an age of uncertainty, and more than a little cultural conflict. There were extraordinary events happening in the time frame of the Leadership Institute's creation, things that would shock and amaze us today. Recall that for 400 days, Americans sat on the edge of their seats wondering what the outcome would be of one of the two great superpowers being beholden to Iranian radicals, with U.S. hostages in a life and death standoff. Out of chaos came resolve, and out of struggle came a commitment to make America great again. Can we say that here? A movement emerged. You had the Goldwater era that progressed to Reagan and then beyond. And there were these key questions, then as well as now. What was the future of the economy? What will that be? What is going to be the future of public policy? Will it be more big government solutions, or will it be the simplicity of the free enterprise system? Of course, in the background, you had the philosophical influences of Burke and Benjamin Constant and Friedrich Hayek and others, again, sort of influencing the debate. Well, I was born in the middle of that recession, 1974, and our home was a very odd place, at least compared to most American homes. My dad was fixated on monetary policy, and even more so, he was concerned about Soviet grand strategy. After all, it was the Cold War. And he was a young conservative trying to understand the nature of freedom, trying to understand the history of freedom, and any threats to freedom which might compromise our way of life and our future history. So, yes, it was galling for him to see the U.S. renege on Bretton Woods, but he was never exactly satisfied with Bretton Woods anyways. He was probably even more critical of the compromises made in 1933 and in 1922 as it related to our currency and monetary stability. But in the 1970s, our precious metals business filled a void. It was stability in an unstable world. Leaving the gold standard behind, it was now up to the individual to safeguard savings from the ravages of inflation. In the late 70s, business boomed as the Russians invaded Afghanistan with the intention of sweeping through the Middle East oil fields and putting a stranglehold on the oil markets. It was in that context that I gave my first speech on inflation. I was 6, and yes, in a small three-piece miniature suit, I had my first introduction to speaking publicly. 4 times a year, growing up, 4 times a year, we would gather with other like-minded families, freedom fighters, public policy experts, even titans of industry, and we would get together with the likes of Woody Jenkins and Morton Blackwell and Howard Phillips and Richard Viguerie for the Council for National Policy. And what I saw there was a demonstration or a modern-day iteration of people that had pledged themselves to the maintenance of America's highest ideals and were willing to roll up their sleeves and get things done on their own time and on their own dime. So what was obvious to me growing up, what I learned by osmosis, is that conservatism was action. That's what I saw as a wee lad. Action for the good of others and against evil. How many times did I hear growing up, all that is necessary for evil to triumph is that good men do nothing? Our dinner table conversations routinely marched through South Africa and the Middle East and Afghanistan. Often sitting at the dinner table were, General Singlaub or Senator H.L. Richardson. Conservatism was a way of life. It was a way of engaging in conversation about world events and their implications. And this is why I said earlier, this feels a little bit like a time machine for me, spending a little bit of time with you this morning. Legacy is a topic that I decided to address, and I wanted to approach it in a slightly different way. Many people in the financial space look at legacy as a very cut and dry type of thing. Hire a lawyer, draw up an estate plan, have your tax documents run sufficiently that you're as efficient as possible. And what is clear to me is that legacy is an inescapable concept. We all create a legacy, we all leave one. And some legacies we're going to be very proud of. Other legacies, perhaps by accident or neglect, we won't be as proud of. So let me start with a definition of legacy. I see it as the total, the sum of values, experience, and culture which you're creating. It's not merely what you leave at the end of your life. It is the expression of your values in everyday choices. It's more than a balance sheet. It's more than an account balance. Legacy includes all the resources that we manage of both the tangible and intangible nature. It's all too easy to focus on sort of empire building and an empire based on square feet and acres and shares or ounces of gold, all of those things being the tangibles. Understandably, intangibles are frustrating because they're more difficult to measure, and progress is much harder to mark out. Ultimate success is harder to account for. You don't get an account statement when it comes to things like virtue and such. So too often we neglect the maintenance and management of the intangibles. Yet it's the intangibles which hold families together through generations. And what holds families together is not too different than what holds a nation together as well. A common vision, a shared identity, appreciation, gratitude, grace, love, forgiveness, courage, loyalty, trust, depth of relationship. These are your intangibles. These are resources that have to be managed just as you would any other tangible resource. Obviously, we're taking an expanded view of a balance sheet. All resources need to be stewarded well. And legacy, again, to go back to that definition, is the total sum of values, experiences, and culture that you're creating. It's more than what you leave at the end of your life. I want to suggest a very different approach. And again, it is what you're creating each day. That is your life message. This past summer, our family visited Germany. We went to Luther's many haunts. It's the 500-year anniversary after his death. He died and his life at work are still remembered. We discussed with our kids the social and the economic and the political and the cultural and the spiritual impact which he had. When we were in Germany, we also visited the Burg Els, or the Els family castle. Generally, when you think about intergenerational legacy, we think about the next generation, our kids, our grandkids. Perhaps if you have an expanded view, it might stretch to 100 years. But this family owns a castle and has held it through 34 generations. And if you recall your Western European geography and history, that's no small feat. Their story is one of managing both intangibles and tangibles. You see, the idea of legacy has really been hijacked by wealth managers, of which I am one, but it has been sequestered and become something shrunk down to consist only of cash and bonds and stocks and real estate and the things that you leave at the end of your life. All those are tangible in nature. But the intangible resources are typically left out, and they're left for consultation with a priest or an ethicist or a psychologist or a sociologist, and they're the ones who are supposed to be able to be qualified to speak to those intangibles. Yes, the castle is a physical edifice. It has real costs to maintain it. They have property taxes and maintenance costs. There is a tangible part to the legacy equation for the Els family, but there are intangibles as well. And I think the tangible aspects pale in comparison to the management of values which have allowed for something to go on for 950 years within one family. I spoke with a family historian while there, and he pointed to three intangibles which defined their legacy. One was diplomacy, external threat mitigation, and a sensitivity to relationships that could either make or break them. They adopted their own form of micro-statecraft, and they avoided conflict at all costs. What they watched repeatedly happen was neighboring fiefdoms would win in battle, and then ultimately lose once and lose everything forever. And so they chose a path of peace in order to avoid forfeiting in an armed conflict which they could never regain. The second intangible was civility. There were three separate households, three brothers living in one compound, in one castle, and kindness and civility ruled the castle and set the groundwork for interactions which were peaceful within, just as diplomacy promoted the same without. The final intangible which marked the Els family was sentimentality. Each successive generation recognized that what they had was distinct. They appreciated it, and they recognized that it was worth preserving. There was not only a conveyance of heritage and a bequest of legacy, but there was on the receiving end an acknowledgement of what the next generation must do to preserve and to protect and to grow what earlier generations had set in motion. Diplomacy, civility, and sentimentality, these are not balance sheet items you're accustomed to hearing about. Perhaps you've thought of legacy in terms of only tangible assets. In our work as asset managers, as precious metals traders, we work with tens of thousands of clients across the country. And it's a cross-section of, on the whole, politically conservative, hardworking, civically minded, civically interested people. We've watched the life cycle of clients now in our 46th year of business and observed that the values of one generation, just like the wealth created in one generation, rarely passes through to the third or fourth generation. It's the proverbial issue of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Rarely is wealth maintained, earned in one generation, and the next generation knows very well how to spend and ultimately dissipate what was created. Ideals are the same, and values, I think, too. Rarely is the culture of earlier generations deliberately passed on in a way that can be absorbed, appreciated, enjoyed, and is seen as a compelling birthright and source of identity. Somehow the message is lost. This is what troubled me as I was writing the book, was that no one seemed to see what was more and more obvious as I looked at our case studies within the families that we worked with through our wealth management group. It was broken relationships. It was broken relationships more than broken bank accounts, which were the typical cause of legacy failure on an intergenerational basis. So while that concerns us as asset managers, it's far more disturbing to consider the sociocultural consequences. Whether it's a faith orientation, a set of moral principles, or a political philosophy, it's difficult. It's difficult to convey valuable truths when the necessary preparatory work has not been done. So I ask you this question: are you living your values in a way that is itself compelling? Are we demonstrating the value of the intangible resources we want in our family, in our culture, in our country? Is it being distilled by one generation for the next to learn, to love, to respect, to enjoy, to be able to reformulate, to be able to iterate for passage on to the next generation? I want to share with you 3 basic principles of successful legacies, and apply this however you wish to your existing family, a family you may have someday, a political arena you exist within. These are not bound by life circumstance. You could be widowed, divorced, single, young, old, rich, poor. A successful legacy is within your grasp if you start by considering these 3 things. The importance of starting here is that for all the macro level issues, the concerns, the problems that we may see, whether it's fiscal or public policy related, macro level issues were at one time micro. And the aggregation of the micro makes for either success or failure. It makes for things that we are proud of, or it makes for the issues that we need to resolve. Think of our fiscal dysfunction. $20.6 trillion in debt was not accrued all at once, not by one generation, not by one political party, Time and small compromises gave us a macro level headache. The good and the bad are created by the aggregation of little things. So here are the three principles, and we'll explore each of them in turn. Number one is that successful legacies are intentional. Number two, successful legacies survive disturbance. And number three, successful legacies focus on the little things. So successful legacies being intentional. What does that word mean? It's being purposeful. It's being thoughtful. Intentionality considers goals and objectives. Intentionality begins when you choose to live with purpose, when you set out to teach and to train and to prepare towards particular objectives. You can see a high degree of an intentionality demonstrated in this organization, its existence since 1979, towards particular goals with a particular agenda. What are the categories that apply in terms of intentionality and the creation of legacy on a more personalized basis? The categories are of the mind and of the heart and of the body and of financial stewardship. All of these are categories which fit into a larger context of life stewardship, how you are cultivating, how you are growing, how you are developing all of the resources that you have. Is it possible to curate life events which buttress the end goals which you have? I'll give you an example. If successful legacies are intentional and you want to curate life events, knowing that, for instance, my 50th birthday coincides with my son's 18th birthday provides a unique opportunity for me to match up those dates and do something that is significant to that relationship. That's one way in which I could be intentional and curate a life event to buttress an end goal. Some are content to see life unfold at random, and I would suggest that intentionality is critical to defining and realizing your legacy objectives. The second principle I wanted to share is that successful legacies survive disturbance, and they do that by adopting a redemptive ethic. So what is disturbance and what is a redemptive ethic? Well, disturbance is a part of life. It can be any upset, any disappointment, any tragedy, any loss, any failure. And the question is, how do you respond? What is your culture? Is it one of redemption? Is it one of hope in the midst of chaos and loss? Or is it one of judgment and accusation? Do you band together or do you turn on each other? How do you value each other? How do you extend grace? A redemptive ethic looks at circumstances which are less than ideal and seeks to straighten what is crooked, mend what is wounded, fix what is broken. It's a way of living with others that looks for getting things back on track when things don't go as hoped for or as expected. It is full of hope, and it depends utterly on graciousness. I think it's rooted in love. It doesn't cast aside, it doesn't quit, it doesn't walk away when disappointed. It graciously, lovingly deals with what is less than ideal while maintaining a vision for the ideal. In some respects, it's about creating enough margin so that disturbance doesn't take you out. The third principle is that successful families focus on, and successful legacies focus on the basics. Again, you can have the best legal documents or tax plans, and what those fail to do is bind hearts together. How often do you make small deposits to the love bank? How significant are the withdrawals which you make in the relationships that you're in? Little things define big things. If you want macro-level success, surely macro-level thinking helps. It's vital. But it's micro-level delivery which brings ideas to reality. Do you want your legacy ideals to go the distance? Then I would suggest that you focus on the basics. I'll give you one example. My daughter and I wake up first thing in the morning, and we have honey, just a spoonful of honey. I carry her downstairs. She's small enough for me to do that still. And I set her on the countertop, and we sit, and for 5 minutes, we talk. We talk about the dreams that she had or did not have. We talk about what she's thinking or feeling. And in the life of my daughter, as sure as day follows night, this 5 minutes is sort of one of the parts of her guaranteed existence. I saw something emerge a few months ago, which dawned on me was an expression of solidarity. I was leaving town on a business trip, and she marched up to me as I was leaving, gave me a big hug, and said, "I'm not having honey until you get back in town." And it is these little things within our daily and weekly routines which define something as esoteric as solidarity. She didn't know that's what she was expressing, but that's exactly what it was. So maybe it's a family night, Fridays, or a date night on Tuesday, or a Saturday breakfast with a friend or family member, or a Sunday family feast. Big successes are based on little successes, and big failures on little failures that aggregate over time. As one of the ancient Greeks said, Aristotle, we are what we frequently do. We reveal what we treasure by the things that we're committed to each day. In the end, legacy is the aggregate of our choices. It's vision, it's planning, it's action, it's love, it's forgiveness. It's the little things that define the course of legacy. So, in an upside-down kind of way, think small to think big. As I often ask my kids, how do you eat an elephant? The answer, of course, is one bite at a time. We have repetition, we have habit, we have routine. Family life and legacy is defined by the fixed points in the day, the week, and the month, even by something as small as a spoonful of honey. So where are we going? What do you aspire to? What does financial responsibility or success look like? Are you going to be skilled in creating at the microcultural level, within the family, within your own life, the management of those intangible resources which leads holistically, again, to care being taken to the life of the mind, the life of the heart, shared activities, enjoyment, what is life together? So to recap, we have successful legacies which require intentionality, which require a redemptive ethic to survive the inevitabilities of life, which includes disturbance. And successful legacies focus on the basics, micro decisions for macro level success. As I set out to understand why so many legacies fail, I discovered that relational structures are often inadequately built. So if logistics are 80 to 90% of warfare, then creating a compelling context for ideas and intangibles, that is 80 to 90% of what goes into a next generation taking the torch and running with it. My hope is that the Leadership Institute continues to capture that, and the next generation of young leaders will, with gratitude, learn all they can, create their own legacy success on the basis of vision, planning, and proper execution of the micro-level details. Aristotle reflects that human flourishing is found in action. This is a place, LI, that ultimately promotes human flourishing. That is a great legacy. Thank you.